Speaking of Philly, Frank, they made some big news earlier today. John Tortorella is out as head coach. He was in the third year of a fourth-year deal. He does not make it to the end of that third season. And you see here a coaching career that began all the way back in 1988 as an assistant. Torts is done in Philly. Frank, were you at all surprised by this, or did his comments yesterday maybe poke the Flyers in this direction?
No shock at all to me. 36 hours after essentially saying, I'm not interested in learning how to coach a team in this spot, the Flyers had to take action. You can't have someone as the front-facing public face of your organization saying that he doesn't have any interest in coaching a team that's going to be in the same exact spot next season. They're not going to be vastly different. And that's something that probably, if he was saying it publicly, which he's obviously no dummy, to media in Toronto after your team gets waxed 7-2, you know exactly what you're broadcasting. And if he is saying it publicly, then he had obviously been internalizing it and feeling it for a while, this team that's been out of the mix for basically more or less the entire season. They have not been a threat. How else would this end? He had to have known that those words coming out of his mouth would be untenable for the Flyers organization moving forward. They're grasping for relevance. They're struggling to compete. They've got a group of players that are beaten down. They've lost 11 of their last 12 or something to that effect. They saw two of their closest friends and teammates traded away earlier this season in Frost and Farabee, two guys that were basically, I think, depressed by John Tortorella in their career path and development. There was no end road for them, no light at the end of the tunnel for them in Philadelphia, largely because of the coach. And then now you make this decision, which kind of puts you back at square one. We'll get to the next step and what they need in the next coach, but this was a move that had to be made if you're Danny Briere and Keith Jones. Those words cannot come out of his mouth, and it's even more troubling that they were thoughts prior.
Yeah, reading Danny Briere's statement that he put out this morning, love that Briere pointed out just how much work Tortorella does in the community. I think as much as Torts is a prickly character in front of the camera and as a coach, I think as a person, everyone recognizes and respects what he does away from the rink. But there was a line in there where Briere said, John played a vital role in our rebuild. He set the standard of play and reestablished what it means to be a Philadelphia Flyer. And the reason I want to bring this up is you don't exactly tie in Torts and what he's done in his career with a guy who would be a good coach for a rebuild. And
because he's not.
Pardon?
I was going to say because he's not.
Because he's not. And where I wanted to go with this, and I don't want it to come off in the wrong way, but if you gave the Flyers in some magical world a redo, do you think they would like to redo this hire? Was he maybe just, when you look back, not the right guy to bring on and take on this kind of challenge?
Well, I've been saying it for 3 years on our show. I mean, undeniably great coach. Like, please do not mistake the message. Undeniably great coach, poor coach for a team embarking on a rebuild. And to be fair, and I think this should be pointed out when you ask the question about a redo, John Tortorella was not hired by Danny Briere and Keith Jones. They inherited him. So they were in a spot where they have this guy making, by NHL coaching standards, pretty massive money. It was a 4-year, $16 million deal. They're not in a position to just chuck that out the window the first 5 minutes they arrive. And look, when it comes to setting the standard, my issue with that is that John Tortorella is not the arbiter solely of what a standard is. And I love that he has compete thresholds and he wants his team to work as hard as possible. But when I say going to great coach, wrong coach for a rebuild, it's because he also at the same time squeezes every drop out of every team that he's ever coached. And when that's the case, you have a year like last year where you're picking in the middle of the first round as opposed to the top 5. And it just kind of further delays the process that you're trying to get to with finding high quality players to build your team around. And then the next part of it is the drafting and development part. But John Tortorella, and I want to say this very clearly, John Tortorella, when he says about playing the right way or what it takes to play the right way, I'm not saying that he doesn't know what it is. Of course he does. He's won a Stanley Cup and he's beaten that into players year after year, but he's not the sole arbiter of that.
Yeah. So as we move on to what's next, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about Torts in just a second, but in terms of what's next for the Flyers, like I just kind of said, would they have maybe liked to redo with that hire? And you said Briere and Jones didn't hire him, but this next move that they make, is it going to maybe tell us a little bit about how they view themselves? Like, are they going to go after, and I saw people doing like, Rick Tocchet's a free agent, there's your guy, like that's a fit in Philly. Are they going to go that route and go with an established, not retread, but a head coach who they maybe think can make them more competitive and push them to the playoffs? Or are they going to go in the direction of, let's get someone who can grow with this team a little bit?
I think the smart direction would be going with a coach that can grow with them. It's not that Rick Tocchet wouldn't, or another established head coach wouldn't come in and do a good job. That's not what's in question. The question is this roster ready to take a step like that? And I think the answer to that is no. This team, they've got a couple good pieces, and the next coach, whoever it is going to have to try and maximize and get the most out of whatever he can from Matvei Michkov, for instance, and Tyson Forrester and that group of players. And to be fair, again, to John Tortorella, he made Owen Tippett helped make Owen Tippett into the player that he is, that ended up signing a $50 million contract. He was a guy that had stints in Florida and in the minors and elsewhere that no one could get out of him what he did. So there is certainly been some bright spots to that. That said, for another established coach, you have to set proper expectations as to what the Flyers are and where they're heading. And they're still a few years away from being a team that's truly in a position to compete.
Yeah, they really are, especially when you look at the landscape in the Eastern Conference and some of these young teams that appear to be only getting better. For Tortorella, he's 66 years old, and our guy Jeremiah comments, Torts will have a media job in 5 minutes. Like,
Sure.
Do you think John Tortorella gets another crack at coaching in the NHL? Do you get a sense that he wants another crack? Like, is this the end for Torts? Does he do the Barry Trotz thing? And I know everyone talked about it, and you were the one who was correctly throwing cold water on it the whole time, but like, could Torts move upstairs somewhere else?
Somewhere else, but it was never going to be an option in Philadelphia. That was never part of their thought process or plan, as much as the idea of him sitting up in the press box for some games and watching. People started to ask questions about that. Would that be a path? I don't think the Flyers had any interest in making something like that happen. That said, I don't know what's next. If you said to me that you have a team that's right on the cusp, that has poor habits, that is a Stanley Cup contender or in that inner or outer circle, wanted to bring in John Tortorella and he was hungry to do it, by all means, like I think he'd be a really good fit for a limited period of time, 2 years and out. But this question that he asked of himself, I'm not really interested in this. Is it that? And where the Flyers are? And that's a deep-rooted question for that only John Tortorella can answer. Or is it the state of the game in general? Because even, going back to what Jeremiah mentioned, how many clips did we see of John Tortorella on ESPN ripping the Michigan goals scored and everything else? It's a guy that, to me, seems like, with where he's at in his life and his career and what he's accomplished, sees the game a very certain way, which goes back to me and the comments that I made about him being the only arbiter of this. And then the other part of it, which is the game changes and evolves. And if a cup contender wants to bring him in, I get it. But short of that, going to any other situation remotely close to this, I think would be setting your team back.
John Tortorella has not led a team deeper than the second round of the playoffs since the 2011-2012 season, when he went on a run as the New York Rangers head coach.
What's up, hockey fans? If you enjoyed that video, then you need to be hitting the subscribe button right here at Daily Faceoff. Exclusive interviews and analysis from our hockey insider Frank Seravalli, fantasy updates from Brock Sagan, and a daily live show at noon Eastern, Monday through Friday. You don't want to miss any of the fantastic content, so hit that subscribe button.